Okay. So now part two of chapter 11, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. And so it can be traced to the US macroeconomic policy decisions from 65 to 68. And this is where I think it's so interesting how US politics really affects the world. What happened was President Johnson was in power at that time, and he did not want to um, increase taxes, right? Because no politician is popular when they need to increase taxes. But he did have an increase in spending. So the US started financing huge increases in welfare programs, and also the Vietnam War needed money. So it caused then significant inflation. And so now the US had a problem. There was speculation that the dollar would have to be devalued relative to most other currencies, forcing other countries to increase the value of the currencies relative to the dollar, right? So again, the other currencies are connected to the dollar, but that all depended on the US being strong and doing well. That on the well-managed, as we said, economically well-managed US. So this is really the Achilles heel of Bretton Woods. And so when the US was not doing well, which happens, right, which could happen, the Bretton Woods agreement collapsed, unfortunately. And so since then, we've had a managed float system. A floating exchange was formalized in 1976 during Jamaica meeting with the IMF members, and the rules for the International Monetary System agreed upon at the meeting are still in place today. So this is what we use. So what is that all about? There are three major parts of this floating exchange rate. First, floating rates were declared acceptable, so floats could just rate move with the market. However, people were buying and selling currencies. Gold was finally abandoned as a reserve asset because gold was still in place in a smaller way. And the total IMF quotas also were increased then by 41 billion. And so now there's more ability for the IMF to go out and help countries that were not doing so well, mostly developing countries. Now that today this number is 767 billion. So you can see now that can increase power and value of the IMF. And this could all be used in non-oil exporting companies, which I think is important to note. And they were given greater access now to the IMF funds. So Western countries were left abandoned now that the US wasn't guiding their currencies, but we definitely were we're moving towards a more free and floating market. So exchange rates since 1973, they have become more volatile and less predictable, fortunately or unfortunately. Let's look at what happened. There was an oil crisis in 1971. OPEC quadrupled the price of oil. So there was a quick decline in the US dollar. There was a loss of confidence in the dollar after US inflation jumped between 77 and 78. There was another oil crisis in 1979. Here again, OPEC drastically increased prices. There was an unexpected rise in the dollar between 80 and 85 because there was immense innovation and speculation on what was happening in the United States. But then there was a rapid fall of the dollar against the Japanese yen and the German Deutschmark. There was a crash after 85 to 87. It did better, but then in 93, 97, we crashed against the yen and the Deutschmark. There was a partial collapse of the EMS in 1992, right? That's the George Soros issue case that I linked on Brightspace, which is such an interesting case study when it comes to foreign exchange markets, how he borrowed all this money to really sabotage the British pound, and that he ended up, forcing the British pound to devalue so quickly over one day with the use of his hedge fund. And involving the German Deutschmark, and as I said, making $1 billion for himself over 24 hours, and using his persuasion techniques to encourage people to jump on the bandwagon and do this with him. And as I said, because the British government then had to quickly increase interest rates, and moved very, very quickly. It became a big mess, and it ended up costing the British citizens $3 billion in taxes over the next couple of years. So there was definitely, and obviously then the UK had to drop out of the EMS. I highly recommend watching the video on Brightspace to better learn about how these policies can really affect what happens, and where there can be loopholes in these situations. So, okay, I won't get too much on a tangent on that. So there's been more volatility in 1997, the Asian currency crisis. This happened in South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, where they lost 50 to 80% of their value in just a few months. And again, where the IMF had to get involved. And then lastly, here on this list, the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2010 and the EU sovereign debt crisis during 2010 to 2011. So again, super interesting to see how, because we have this floating rate, there can be more potential for volatility. We see the currencies, major currencies dollar index, I think is pretty cool to look at. You'll see that there are peaks and valleys that, between all those oil prices, etc. It drops, it comes down. Here we had, is doing really well in the early 80s. As I said, a lot of great speculation in the United States about new innovations. But then very, very quickly between 80 and 87, there was a huge devaluation. And the IMF, had to jump in, and, the US government had to jump in to help. They came together through what's called the Plaza Accord, and then again through the Louvre Accord to try to fix the devaluation. I remember my dad was a consultant during this time. I was like 12 years old. And as I mentioned, he's worked in human resources. And so he was helping IBM and large organizations that had huge layoffs. And he was helping those employees with their resumes, interviewing skills. He would go in-house to IBM as a consultant to train and work with hundreds, thousands of employees to get back on their feet, because there were so many people that were getting let go in a short time. So that is the end of part 2. Let me go ahead and take a break here, and then I'll see you in a minute for part 3.